Live, travel, adventure, bless, and don't be sorry. America was a challenging place as it approached the middle of the 20th century. The 1930s saw the beginning of the Great Depression, and no jobs and no food led many men to begin traveling around the country looking for work. Now, among the most influential poets, writers, and jazz musicians of that time was Jack Kerouac. He was a writer who became known for his novel On the Road, which he allegedly wrote in one night on a single, very long scroll of paper while using a number of drugs to keep him awake. On the Road was the story of how Kerouac followed his crazy, wild, and adventurous friends across America, and it inspired a generation to do the same. Movement and travel became very popular for young people in America during this time. However, traveling and loneliness caused Jack Kerouac to feel a lot of stress, and the way he handled his stress was drinking alcohol. By 1960s, Jack Kerouac had begun to rely on drinking more and more to deal with his stress and unhappiness. His drinking had started to become out of control, and then, one cold night in 1969, everything changed. But the story of Jack Kerouac is not really that unique. Alcohol is a common way that people deal with their stress and anxiety. And according to a 2018 article by Ritchie and Rosier, in 2010, close to 95% of adults in France had drunk alcohol in the preceding year. And this brings us to the person that I interviewed. Now, he's been living and teaching English in a foreign country for a very long time. And when I asked him what was the main cause of his stress, he told me that it came from culture shock. He constantly feels stress being in this new culture, or this different culture, and the way he deals with this problem is drinking alcohol. Now, according to the Simon Fraser University, culture shock is a common experience when you are transplanted to a foreign setting. This is a normal reaction to a new environment where you are no longer in control as you've been at home. You may experience a range of emotions when adapting to a foreign culture, from excitement and interest to frustration, depression, and fear of the unknown. Now, according to Simon Fraser University, culture shock is a term used to describe what happens to people when they encounter unfamiliar surroundings and conditions. Now, unfortunately, part of the culture shock that my friend experienced was the business drinking culture in the country he lived in. He told me that he was expected to drink with his company almost every night. Oftentimes, he said that people who were older than him would force him to drink with them until 3 or 4 a.m. According to my friend, one night he had to stay out until 5:30 a.m. with his company's president, and then he had an early morning meeting at 7 a.m. He was having trouble finishing all his work because he felt so tired and sick. And this creates what we call a vicious cycle, which means that a negative situation causes another negative reaction, which makes the initial situation even worse, causing more of that negative reaction and making that situation worse again and again. Now, the person who I talked to, my friend, was in a vicious cycle because he felt stress from work, which caused him to drink. But that made it even harder for him to work, which caused him even more stress. So he wanted to drink even more, and so on, never being able to escape this vicious cycle. All right. So what's next? I'm going to stop the sample presentation now, and we're going to just talk about a couple of the things that have happened so far. Well, what do I need to do next? I've talked about my friend, who is definitely not me, and I've talked about the reason why he feels stress, how he deals with his stress, and now what do we have to do? Well, now we have to say, is this a good or a bad way to handle this problem? Is this a good way to deal with stress or a bad way to deal with stress? And you can probably guess that it's a bad way. We're going to say it's bad. So here I've put up 3 different quotes or 3 different pieces of research that we could use to talk about that. We have drinking too much alcohol can quickly kill a person. The inability to metabolize alcohol as quickly as it is consumed can lead to a buildup of alcohol in the brain that shuts down areas necessary for survival, such as those involved with heartbeat and respiration. That would be according to Brownstein, 2014. And the next one is an estimated 88,000 people die from alcohol-related causes annually, making alcohol the 3rd leading preventable cause of death in the United States. That's according to the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And then finally, alcohol consumption, whilst a risk factor for a number of health outcomes, typically has the greatest negative impacts when consumed within heavy sessions. This pattern of drinking is often termed binging, where individuals consume large amounts of alcohol within a single session versus small quantities more frequently, according to Ritchie and Rozier, which we've looked at already. So take a minute and think, which of these would you use next? Well, I think probably the first one is the best to prove that it's a bad way to deal with the problem. We also could have the second one, right? An estimated 88,000 people die every year. So that's also a really good statistic about how dangerous drinking can be. The third one might work nicely earlier in the presentation when I'm talking about drinking again and again and again with the company. Right, so all of these I think I could use in some way or the other. But I want to talk about why it's bad. That's my next step, is I'm going to talk about this is a bad way to deal with his problems. I could suggest perhaps a better way as well. But this is a pretty tricky situation for my friend because he's drinking related to work. So I also may want to look for some way to break out of a vicious cycle. Then when I'm finally done, I need a conclusion. I need to briefly say what I talked about again, the cause of stress, the way to deal with it, and whether or not it's good or bad. Now, you'll remember that my presentation started in a little bit more of an interesting way. I didn't just tell you about the person I was talking to, I found another example. So, the way that I'm going to finish my presentation after my conclusion is returning to my story. So now let's return to the cold night in 1969 with Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac was drinking and having fun with his friends that night until he felt a sharp pain in his stomach. He was rushed to the hospital, but he died later that night. His drinking habit had killed him. Like my friend, who I interviewed, Jack Kerouac was someone who was always traveling and far from home. And he too dealt with his problems by drinking. In fact, it had been connected to his work because Jack Kerouac's audience expected him to drink as well. And he had connected that to his job. So he was not able to break free from that cycle. And he died as a result. Okay. It also might be a good idea, if you remember my first slide, I had a quote. So it would also be a good time maybe to have another quote. Perhaps from Jack Kerouac, or perhaps something that adds to that first idea. So returning to my introduction is a really good idea for me at the end of my presentation. Connecting the introduction and the conclusion is a great idea. Okay, so I want to have, from where I ended, I want to have whether or not it was a good or bad decision, a conclusion where I'm reminding you or summarizing everything I talked about, and then in my case, to make it more interesting, I've returned and finished the story that I told you at the beginning. This makes it more interesting for you as a listener because you remember that first story. And it's a good example in this case because my story of a famous person that was also drinking connected to my story about my friend that I interviewed. I've got references at the end For the pictures, I suggest you just put in the link to where I can find that picture. Don't worry about putting those references in the slides. I also want you to notice that my slides were almost all pictures. So I strongly also suggest you guys just use pictures when you are making your slides.